Joseph had grown up watching crosses line the roads of Galilee, not as a metaphor, as a literal childhood memory, or close enough to one. A regional trauma so recent and so severe that every adult in Nazareth over a certain age had either witnessed its aftermath directly or had it described to them by someone who had. By the time Jesus was old enough to walk to the well alone, Joseph already understood, in a way most modern readers of the Gospels do not, exactly what happened to people, and to entire towns, that drew the wrong kind of attention from Rome or from Herod's family. And he was raising a son who was, by every account the Gospels eventually preserve, unusually difficult to overlook. We are stepping into the political weather Joseph lived inside right now. In 4 BCE, Herod the Great died. In the chaos that followed his death, a man named Judas, son of a bandit leader called Hezekiah, led a raid on the royal armory at Sepphoris, the same city 4 miles from Nazareth, that would later employ Galilean builders, including, very likely, Joseph and his son. Rome's response was swift and brutal. The Roman governor of Syria, Quintilius Varus, marched south with his legions to restore order. Sepphoris was burned. The wider Galilean countryside was pacified through mass violence. The first-century historian Josephus records, in both the Jewish War and the Antiquities, that Varus crucified roughly 2,000 men along the roads of Galilee as a deterrent to further rebellion. 2,000 crosses, lining roads that Joseph, as a young man coming of age in or near Nazareth at almost exactly this time, would have known personally. Roads he likely walked himself before or shortly after this happened, in a region small enough that the visible and remembered aftermath of this event would have shaped an entire generation's understanding of what Rome was capable of doing to people who provoked it. This was not ancient history to Joseph. It was the formative political memory of his own generation, the event every Galilean father and mother of his age cohort had lived through directly, in a region small enough that nearly everyone knew, or knew of, someone affected. Trauma like this does not simply fade once the immediate crisis passes. It becomes encoded into how a community teaches its children to behave in public, what kinds of speech are considered safe, how visible a family allows itself to become. Parents who lived through the Varus aftermath would have raised their own children with a particular, well-earned wariness about anything that might draw Roman or Herodian attention. Joseph raised Jesus inside that wariness. Every lesson about caution, every instinct about which conversations were safe to have in public and which were not. Every calculation about how visible the family should allow itself to become. All of it was shaped by a man who had come of age watching what happened to a region that provoked the wrong response from Rome. A second related episode unfolded roughly a decade later, around 6 CE, when Rome converted Judea into a directly administered province and imposed a formal census for taxation purposes. A Galilean named Judas, sometimes called Judas of Galilee, distinct from the earlier Judas son of Hezekiah, led a tax revolt in protest, an episode the historian Josephus records in detail in the Antiquities, and one later referenced even in the book of Acts. This second uprising occurred at almost exactly the period when Jesus, by Luke's account, made his recorded pilgrimage to Jerusalem at age 12, a moment of heightened political tension throughout the region, when religious nationalism, Roman taxation policy, and Herodian authority were all under active strain simultaneously. Joseph, raising a son who was about to demonstrate unusual public boldness inside the Jerusalem temple during exactly this volatile period, was not parenting in a politically neutral environment. He was parenting during one of the most actively monitored periods in recent Galilean memory. A tecton working construction contracts in Sepphoris, the rebuilt administrative capital of Galilee under Herod Antipas, would have had direct, regular proximity to the visible machinery of Herodian rule in a way most Nazareth villagers never did. Roman-style buildings under construction, Herodian officials moving through the city on official business, garrisoned soldiers stationed to protect the seat of regional administration, tax collectors and informants operating through the same urban networks that employed local builders. Joseph, working inside this environment, likely had a more granular, practical understanding of how quickly Rome and Herod's administration could and did respond to perceived threats than the average villager confined to Nazareth's smaller, more insulated daily life. This was not abstract political awareness. It was the working knowledge of a man who had watched the machinery of occupation function up close, on a regular basis, for years. Reconsider now the temple incident at age 12 through this lens. Jerusalem during Passover was not a calm, purely devotional environment. The historian Josephus records multiple episodes of deadly unrest during pilgrim feasts in this exact period, including a notorious riot under the procurator Archelaus's predecessor that resulted in thousands of deaths inside the temple precincts themselves, a memory still recent enough during Jesus' childhood to inform how carefully the temple authorities and Roman garrison monitored crowd behavior during every subsequent feast. A 12-year-old boy sitting among senior religious teachers, asking and answering questions with an understanding that astonished them in this specific, heavily monitored environment, was not simply a charming anecdote for a father in Joseph's position. It was a recognizable category of risk. A child drawing the kind of attention that, in the wrong combination of circumstances, could escalate into exactly the sort of scrutiny that had gotten entire communities burned within Joseph's own living memory. Joseph's relief at finding Jesus alive and well in the temple, recorded implicitly in Luke's account, almost certainly carried an additional layer that the text does not spell out. Relief that the unusual public attention his son had attracted had not yet drawn the more dangerous kind of notice that Joseph's political experience had taught him to fear. There is no record of Joseph voicing any of this directly, not to Mary, not to anyone. His silence throughout the gospel narrative, already noted for other reasons, takes on an additional weight here. A man who had been told by an angel that his foster son's kingdom would have no end, and who had separately lived through the direct, visible consequences of Rome's response to perceived political threats, was carrying two pieces of information that did not obviously fit together comfortably. If the angel's words were literally true in any way that involved public recognition or authority, how would Rome and Herod's family respond to that recognition, given everything Joseph had personally witnessed about how this regime handled threats to its authority? This is not a question the text answers, or even raises directly. But it is a question that a man with Joseph's specific lived political experience would have been nearly impossible not to ask himself privately, repeatedly, across the years he spent watching his unusually gifted, unusually visible son grow toward adulthood. A father with Joseph's experience would have taught practical caution, even if it was never explicitly framed as political instruction. Care about which conversations happened in the marketplace versus inside the home. Awareness of which neighbors might repeat overheard remarks to the wrong listener. In a system where informants operating on behalf of Herodian or Roman authority were a documented feature of provincial administration. He would have watched, instinctively, for the specific signs that preceded the violence he remembered. Soldiers moving through the region in unusual numbers, tax officials appearing with new demands, the particular tension in a crowd that, in his memory, had once preceded catastrophe at Sepphoris. None of this guaranteed safety. It could not have. But it shaped the household Jesus grew up in, one where caution about visibility was not paranoia, but inherited, hard-earned wisdom from a man who had watched what happened when a region failed to read the warning signs in time. Joseph disappears from the gospel record after the temple episode. The most widely held scholarly inference, based on his complete absence from every account of the adult ministry, is that he died sometime during the years between Jesus' adolescence and the beginning of the public ministry, likely from natural causes or from the ordinary occupational hazards of a builder's physically demanding trade, rather than from any recorded act of political violence. This means Joseph's decades of watchfulness, of careful instinct about visibility and caution, of private political dread shaped by a childhood spent near burning cities and crucified bodies, ended without ever being tested against the actual outcome he may have spent years quietly fearing. He did not live to see the crowds the ministry would eventually draw. He did not live to see the confrontations with religious authorities that would escalate across 3 years of public teaching. He did not live to see the cross, the exact category of Roman punishment his own childhood memory had taught him to fear above almost anything else. But he also never lived to see whether his decades of careful instinct had been the thing that kept his family safe through the most dangerous years, or whether danger had simply not yet arrived on his watch. His vigilance and his death arrived together, leaving the question permanently unresolved within his own lifetime. A legacy of protective caution that outlived the man who built it, inherited by a mother who would carry the step back now. The burned city and the 2,000 crosses that shaped Joseph's entire generation's political consciousness. The census revolt that coincided almost exactly with his son's first dangerous brush with public visibility. The builder's proximity to Herodian administration that gave him sharper, more practical fear than most of his neighbors carried. The temple incident reread as a recognizable category of risk, not just a parenting scare. The questions he could never voice aloud, even to Mary. The instinctive caution he built into an entire household. And the death that arrived before any of his fears could be confirmed or relieved. This was Joseph's particular burden, not a single dramatic threat, but decades of accumulated, well-informed dread carried silently, about a son whose eventual path he could sense the shape of without ever living long enough to see where it actually led. Here is the quiet truth. If you have ever carried a fear for someone you love, that you could never fully voice, built from experience no one around you fully shared, and never lived to see resolved one way or the other, you are standing exactly where Joseph stood, watching the horizon for a storm he was right to expect and never got to see arrive. If this changed how you see the world Joseph raised his family inside, share it with someone tonight. Subscribe if you want to keep walking through the stories no one tells you. Drop in the comments. What hit you hardest? The 2,000 crosses near Sepphoris? The temple incident reread as political risk? The vigilance he never saw vindicated? I read every one. See you in the next one.